Today, we're taking a deeper dive into a Canadian Border Services Agency internal audit and our own exclusive access to information documents that detail gaps in security screening of Syrian refugees both before and after they came to Canada. Now, today's the second part in a 4-part expose. We're looking into the systemic failures of government protocols designed to weed out national security threats. Late last year, a full version of a heavily redacted Canadian Border Services Agency internal audit was leaked to the mainstream media. The audit detailed security gaps in what they called Operation Syrian Refugee, or the mission to meet Justin Trudeau's electoral promise of 50,000 Syrian refugees brought into Canada before the end of 2015. Now, the mainstream media devoted a story or two to this report at the time, but given that it revealed at least 150 cases that didn't receive proper security screening, we decided to do a more intense investigation. We got the full audit and now finally our own exclusive access to information documents to go along with it so we can tell you the full story, the whole truth the government didn't want you to know. Now, yesterday I told you about specific numbers of refugees that had not been screened effectively by the government. Some 135 of them weren't even subject to the most basic open source Google and Facebook searches before admittance to Canada. And I have even more to show you today. It was just too much for one story. So let's get right back into these documents. This document here lays out some key findings of the internal audit. Under number 21, these gaps became apparent during a compliance review of a sample of 54 Syrian refugee applicant case files. The review found that in 6 cases, not all mandatory security screening system checks were completed and/or had the results documented in the agency's case management system. Okay, let's just stop right there. 6 cases out of a random sampling of 54. That means if we expand, 1 in 9 Syrian refugee case files isn't really receiving the scrutiny that is required. Those are pretty good odds if you're a bad guy trying to get into the country by pretending to be a desperate Syrian refugee. And of those 6 cases from that sampling of 54, in 1 there was no evidence whatsoever that the mandatory checks were performed at all. In 4 cases, there was no evidence of an integrated query check. And in the last case, they discovered that not even an open source check was performed. So they didn't even do a basic Google search of the guy or his family or go to their social media. The report found that criminality assessment procedures were completed on all but 1 of their samplings of refugees. That sounds great on paper, but what is a criminality test? Well, it sounds like they're just asking somebody if they're a criminal. Because if you look at the top paragraph of this document here, it reads, police checks or certificates of no criminal conviction from the refugee's home country were not required, and police checks were not requested from the refugee's countries of temporary asylum. So these migrants may have committed crimes, even war crimes, in the countries that they're coming from, and may have continued to commit crimes in the countries where they went to apply to come to Canada, safe countries like Turkey. And they may have continued their criminality there, but we'll never know because those questions were not required to be asked of refugees. And even if they were required, there's not adequate record keeping in the countries of origin or through which they've migrated to prove that they're not criminals. Now, this is one of the original documents here from Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada that was heavily redacted. They've removed a lot of the numbers now that I've already reported on, so I guess their attempt to hide things from the public didn't quite work out the way they thought it would. But they left something unhidden at the bottom of this document that is very, very damning. 305 files that had passed security assessments and were approved final assessments, but that had also an inconclusive result under security screening status. It was unclear why inconclusive and especially non-favorable security screening outcomes could result in approved security assessment and ultimately an approved application. So on the immigration files themselves, the workers could see that the security screening status information was marked as inconclusive or non-favorable. But nobody asked any questions and approved the refugees' files anyways. And here in these government documents we obtained through access to information, the bureaucrats actually seem surprised that 200 refugee case files had been refused for security reasons, including serious criminality and non-compliance with the act or having an inadmissible family member. And we can see bureaucrats thought that number was just a little too high for their liking. Now, this final access to information document from IRCC details the process changes that were made for Operation Syrian Refugee that may have weakened controls designed to ensure that all required security checks were finally completed. Positive reporting was used for open source and integrated query checks, and as a result, analysts were required to follow up on only 4 cases where there was a concern or hit, and analysts were not otherwise required to validate that these checks had even been completed. And secondly, the template used during Operation Syrian Refugee was modified such that the requirement to document open source and integrated query checks was excluded. Let's just stop right there for a second. So there were mechanisms in place to make sure these Google searches and integrated query checks were actually being done, but that requirement was removed for the Syrian refugees. The document goes on to say, had the requirement to document all open source and integrated query checks remained in place, the 150 cases noted above would most likely have been identified and the checks completed. And we know these changes to procedures were made to meet Justin Trudeau's unrealistic quota of 50,000 refugees admitted before the end of 2015. Justin Trudeau's haste and arbitrary targets put us all in danger. Tomorrow I'm going to show you some specific cases of fraudulent refugees and people who claimed inconvenience as the reason they needed to come to Canada. For the Rebel.media, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. Silicon Valley and big tech has a thing for censoring conservatives, but we've got a way around that. We have our own Rebel Media mobile app. You can get it on the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. Download it, give it a whirl, and take the other side of the story with you wherever you go.